My name is Marcus Chen, and 30 years ago, on a cold December night in Minneapolis, Minnesota, my parents threw me out of the house with nothing but the clothes on my back and $27 in my wallet. I was 18, fresh out of high school, and I had just told them I wanted to pursue music instead of becoming a doctor like they'd planned for me since I was 5 years old. The snow was falling heavy that night, coating the suburban streets of our middle-class neighborhood in a thick white blanket. I can still remember the sound of our front door slamming behind me, the finality of that click echoing through the winter air. My father's words still ring in my ears. If you want to throw your life away on this foolish dream, you're no son of ours. Don't come back until you come to your senses. I stood there on the sidewalk, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air, looking back at the house where I'd grown up. The warm, yellow light from the living room window seemed so distant now, like looking at someone else's life. My mother's silhouette appeared briefly in the window, and for a moment I thought she might open the door, might call me back in. But she turned away, and the curtains closed. My parents, David and Helen Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan in the early 1970s. They'd worked incredibly hard to build a life in America. My father as an engineer at 3M, my mother as a nurse at Abbott Northwestern Hospital. They'd saved every penny, sacrificed everything, all so their only son could have the opportunities they never had. In their minds, success meant one thing: a stable, prestigious career. Medicine, law, engineering, these were the only acceptable paths. But I had different dreams. From the time I was 12 and first picked up a guitar at a friend's house, music had been my passion. I spent every free moment learning songs, writing lyrics, practicing until my fingers bled. I played in the school band, formed a garage band with my friends, and even won a local talent show my senior year. Music wasn't just what I wanted to do. It was who I was. The confrontation had been building for months. My parents had already enrolled me at the University of Minnesota for pre-med classes starting in January. They'd paid the deposits, bought the textbooks, even helped me fill out the paperwork, but I couldn't go through with it. The night I told them I wanted to defer college and try to make it as a musician, my father exploded like I'd never seen before. "You ungrateful child," he'd shouted, his face red with anger and disappointment. "We sacrificed everything for you. Your mother worked double shifts for years to save for your education, and this is how you repay us? With this noise?" My mother had tried to mediate, speaking in rapid Mandarin to my father, but he was beyond reasoning. When I insisted that music was my calling, that I had real talent and wanted to at least try, he gave me an ultimatum: choose. The university and your family, or this foolish dream and the streets. You can't have both. I chose music. And that's how I ended up walking through the snowy streets of Minneapolis at midnight, homeless and heartbroken, but determined to prove them wrong. I spent that first night in an all-night diner on University Avenue, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to figure out what to do next. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Rita with kind eyes and a world-weary smile, seemed to understand my situation without me saying a word. She kept refilling my cup and pretended not to notice when I dozed off in the booth around 3 a.m. "Rough night, honey?" she asked when I woke up to the morning rush of customers. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Everything felt surreal, like I was living in someone else's nightmare. "Family troubles," Rita continued, wiping down the table next to mine. "Something like that," I managed to say. She studied my face for a moment, then reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a business card. "My brother runs a youth hostel downtown. It's not much, but it's clean and safe. Tell him Rita sent you. He'll give you a fair rate." That business card probably saved my life. The hostel was a converted warehouse in the North Loop district, full of young people in similar situations, some kicked out by their families, others just trying to make it in the big city. The manager, Rita's brother Tom, was a former social worker who understood that sometimes young people needed a second chance. I paid for a week in advance, which left me with $8 to my name. Tom noticed my guitar case and mentioned that the hostel had a small performance space in the basement where residents could practice or even put on shows. "Nothing fancy," he said, "but it's got decent acoustics and a little stage. Maybe you can earn a few bucks playing for tips." That first week was the hardest of my life. I'd wake up every morning hoping to find a missed call from my parents on the payphone in the hostel lobby. I'd walk past our house sometimes, just hoping to catch a glimpse of them, maybe see some sign that they missed me too. But the house looked the same as always, the curtains drawn, my father's car in the driveway, life going on without me. I applied for every job I could find: dishwasher, delivery driver, retail clerk, anything that would hire an 18-year-old with no experience. Most places weren't hiring because it was right after Christmas, but finally, I got a job at a record store called Electric Fetus. It was minimum wage, but it was something. My manager at the record store was a guy named Jake, probably in his 30s, with long hair and multiple tattoos. He'd been in bands himself and understood the struggle. When business was slow, he'd let me play my acoustic guitar in the store, and customers would sometimes tip me. It wasn't much, but every dollar helped. "You've got something, kid," Jake told me one afternoon as I finished playing an original song I'd written about feeling lost in the world. "Your voice has this raw honesty that you can't fake. Don't give up on this." Those words meant everything to me. At home, my music had been dismissed as noise, as a waste of time. But Jake saw something valuable in it, and that validation kept me going through those dark winter months. The hostel performances became a regular thing. Every Friday night, residents and sometimes people from the neighborhood would gather in the basement to hear whoever wanted to play. I became a regular performer, developing a small but loyal following. People would request the songs I'd written about being kicked out, about missing home, about chasing dreams despite the odds. One night in February, a woman named Sarah approached me after my set. She was probably in her 40s, well-dressed, with an air of authority that immediately caught my attention. "I'm Sarah Martinez," she said, extending her hand. "I run a small booking agency here in the cities. I've been coming to these shows for a few weeks now, and I think you have real potential." My heart started racing. This was the kind of break I'd been hoping for, dreaming about during those long, lonely nights. "I can't promise you'll become a rock star overnight," Sarah continued, "but I can get you some real gigs, coffee shops, small venues, maybe even open for some bigger acts when they come through town. The pay won't be great at first, but it's a start." I wanted to call my parents right then and there, to tell them that someone believed in me, that maybe I wasn't throwing my life away after all. But I knew they wouldn't want to hear from me. Not until I could prove them completely wrong. Sarah was true to her word. Within a month, she had me booked at coffee shops around the Twin Cities area. The gigs were small, playing for tips and maybe $50 a night, but it was real money from my music. I was actually making a living, however modest, doing what I loved. The audiences were small but engaged. There's something magical about playing in intimate venues where you can see every face, where people are really listening to your words. I started developing a reputation as someone who could connect with an audience, who could take the pain and hope in my songs and make other people feel it too. But even as things were starting to look up professionally, the personal cost was enormous. I missed my parents every single day. I'd see families together at restaurants or in the park, and it would hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd written dozens of songs about them, about the night they kicked me out, about wondering if they ever thought about me. The hardest part was not knowing if they were proud of what I was accomplishing, if they ever drove past Electric Fetus and saw my name on the little poster advertising upcoming shows, if they ever wondered whether I was okay. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it felt like a new beginning. I'd been performing regularly for 3 months, had built up a small savings account, and was starting to feel like maybe I could actually make this work. Sarah was talking about getting me into some summer festivals, maybe even recording a small EP. But success felt hollow without family to share it with. Every milestone, every small victory was tinged with sadness, because the people who'd raised me, who'd taught me to work hard and never give up, weren't there to see me applying those lessons to my own dreams. One warm evening in May, I was walking home from a particularly good show at a coffee shop in St. Paul when I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of heading back to the hostel, I turned toward my childhood neighborhood. I hadn't been on my street since those first desperate weeks after being kicked out. As I approached the house, I saw my father in the front yard, tending to my mother's rose garden. He looked older, grayer than I remembered. For a moment, I thought about walking up to him, about trying to bridge the gap that had opened between us. But as I got closer, he looked up and saw me. Our eyes met across the yard, and for just a second I saw something that might have been recognition, maybe even longing. But then his expression hardened, and he turned away, walking back into the house without a word. I stood there on the sidewalk for a long time, just like I had that first night. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't the scared, desperate 18-year-old who'd been thrown out with nothing. I was someone who'd survived, who'd started to build something with my own hands and my own voice. As I walked away from the house that night, I made myself a promise. I would continue to build my career, continue to grow as an artist and as a person. And someday, when I'd achieved something truly remarkable, when I could show them that their son hadn't thrown his life away, but had built something beautiful and meaningful, I would come back. Someday, I would settle the score. The summer of my 19th year was when everything started to change. Sarah had gotten me a regular weekend slot at a coffee shop called The Grind in the trendy uptown neighborhood. It wasn't much, just Friday and Saturday nights, playing for tips and $50 per show, but it was my first consistent gig, and more importantly, it was helping me build a real fan base. The Grind was the kind of place where aspiring writers worked on their novels, art students sketched in worn notebooks, and young professionals came to unwind after long days at downtown offices. The owner, a woman named Carol, who'd moved to Minneapolis from New York in the 80s, had created exactly the kind of atmosphere where original music could thrive. "You remind me of the singer-songwriters who used to play the Village back in my day," Carol told me one night as I packed up my guitar. "There's something authentic about your stuff. You're not trying to be anybody else." That authenticity came from pain, though I didn't tell Carol that. Every song I wrote was filtered through the experience of being rejected by the people who'd raised me. The loneliness, the determination, the desperate hope that someday I'd prove myself worthy of their love. It all poured out through my music. My regular audience at The Grind started to grow. There was Jennifer, a grad student at the University of Minnesota, who came every Friday night and always requested North Star, a song I'd written about feeling lost, but still believing in finding your way home. There was Mike, a construction worker who'd lost his job and related to my songs about starting over. And there was Maria, a high school teacher, who said my music helped her understand her students who were struggling with family conflicts. These people became like a second family to me. They knew my story. I'd never hidden the fact that I'd been kicked out for choosing music over medical school. And they supported me not just with tips and applause, but with genuine emotional investment in my journey. "You know what your problem is?" Jennifer said to me one night after a particularly emotional performance. "You're too humble. You act like you're grateful just to be allowed to play music, but you're actually really good. You should be booking bigger venues, recording an album, getting your music out to more people." She was right, and I knew it. But there was something holding me back, some part of me that felt like I didn't deserve bigger success until I'd somehow earned my parents' approval. It was ridiculous. I was an adult, making my own living, building my own life, but their rejection still haunted every decision I made. That fall, Sarah presented me with an opportunity that would test my commitment to my music career. A local indie label called Northbound Records had heard my demo and wanted to offer me a small recording contract. It wasn't a major label deal, just enough money to record a 6-song EP and do some local promotion, but it was a real contract with a real label. "This is what you've been working toward," Sarah said as we sat in her office looking over the paperwork. "It's not going to make you rich, but it's going to get your music out there in a way that coffee shop gigs never could." I signed the contract that day, my hand shaking slightly as I wrote my name. It felt like crossing a line, making a commitment to this path that would be even harder to walk back from. Not that I wanted to walk back. Music was my life, my passion, my purpose. But signing that paper made it official in a way that performing in coffee shops hadn't. The recording process was incredible. Northbound Records had a small studio in an old warehouse in northeast Minneapolis, run by a producer named Tommy, who'd worked with some of the local bands that had gone on to national success. He understood the raw, emotional quality of my music and knew how to capture it without overproducing it. "The best singer-songwriters don't need a lot of bells and whistles," Tommy explained as we worked on arrangements for my songs. "Your voice and your guitar tell the story. Everything else should just support that." We recorded the EP over 3 weekends in November and December. I'd never heard my voice played back through professional equipment before, and it was both thrilling and terrifying. There I was, singing about being kicked out at 18, about missing family, about chasing dreams despite the odds, and it sounded like real music, like something people might actually want to buy and listen to. The EP was called Northbound, after the record label, but also as a metaphor for the journey I'd been on. The 6 songs told the story of the past year and a half, from the night I was kicked out through the struggles of those first months to the gradual building of a new life and new identity as a musician. When the first box of CDs arrived at the record store where I still worked part-time, I held one in my hands for a long time, just staring at it. There was my name on the cover, my face in the small black and white photo, the titles of songs I'd written during the darkest and most hopeful periods of my life. Jake, my manager at Electric Fetus, was more excited than I was. "This is huge, Marcus. We're going to put these right up front, and I bet we sell every copy within a month." The local music press picked up on the EP almost immediately. City Pages, the alternative weekly newspaper, ran a review that called my music heartbreakingly honest and said I was an artist to watch. The Minnesota Daily, the University of Minnesota's newspaper, did a feature story about local musicians making it in the scene, but the review that meant the most to me came from an unexpected source. The Star Tribune, Minneapolis's major daily newspaper, had a music critic named David Walsh who rarely paid attention to local indie releases. Somehow, though, he'd gotten a copy of Northbound and written a short but incredibly positive review. "Marcus Chen writes and performs with the kind of raw honesty that can't be taught or manufactured," Walsh wrote. "His voice carries the weight of real experience, real pain, and real hope. In an age of manufactured pop music, Chen reminds us why singer-songwriters matter." I cut out that review and kept it in my wallet. It was validation from a source that couldn't be dismissed, proof that I wasn't just fooling myself about my talent. But even as I celebrated these victories, there was always an undercurrent of sadness. I wanted to show these reviews to my parents, wanted them to see that their son was being recognized for his art, that the dream they'd dismissed as foolish was actually coming true. The success of Northbound led to bigger and better gigs. Sarah booked me at First Avenue, the legendary Minneapolis venue where Prince had gotten his start. I was just opening for a bigger act, playing for maybe 30 minutes, but it was First Avenue. I was on the same stage where some of my musical heroes had performed. That night, as I looked out at an audience of several hundred people instead of the 30 or 40 I was used to at coffee shops, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just a hobby anymore, wasn't just something I was doing while I figured out my real life. This was my real life. I was a professional musician, earning money from my art, building a career that was bringing joy and meaning to other people's lives. After the show, a woman approached me at the merchandise table where I was selling CDs and T-shirts Sarah had made for me. "Excuse me," she said, "are you Marcus Chen?" "Yes," I replied, still not used to being recognized by strangers. "I'm Helen Rodriguez from KTCZ Radio. We're a small station, but we focus on local and emerging artists. I'd love to have you on our morning show next week to talk about your music and maybe play a couple of songs acoustic." My first radio interview. I could hardly believe it. This was the kind of exposure that could take my career to the next level, help me reach people beyond the Twin Cities music scene. The radio interview went better than I could have hoped. Helen was a skilled interviewer who asked thoughtful questions about my music and my journey. When she asked about my family situation, she'd clearly done her research. I was honest about being estranged from my parents, but focused on how that experience had shaped my music, rather than dwelling on the pain. "It sounds like your music is really about resilience," Helen said. "About finding your own path, even when the people closest to you don't support it." "That's exactly right," I replied. "I think a lot of young people go through something like this. Maybe not as dramatic as being kicked out, but that conflict between what your family wants for you and what you want for yourself. I hope my music helps people feel less alone in that struggle." After the radio interview aired, something remarkable happened. People started reaching out to me through the record label, through social media, through the venues where I performed. They shared their own stories of family conflict, of choosing unconventional paths, of feeling like they had to choose between their dreams and their relationships. One letter particularly stuck with me. It was from a young woman named Amy, who was a pre-med student at the University of Minnesota. She wrote that she'd heard my interview on the radio and bought my EP, and that it had given her the courage to tell her parents she wanted to switch to studying art instead of medicine. "Your music helped me realize that disappointing your parents in the short term is better than disappointing yourself for your whole life," she wrote. "Thank you for showing me that it's possible to survive choosing your own path." Reading that letter, I realized that my music was doing something I'd never expected. It was helping other young people navigate the same impossible choices I'd faced. My personal pain had become something that could ease other people's struggles, and that gave my journey a meaning beyond just my own success or failure. As my second winter on my own approached, I was in a completely different place than I'd been 12 months earlier. I had a growing fan base, a record deal, albeit a small one, regular gigs at respected venues, and the beginnings of what felt like a real career in music. But success brought its own challenges. The more recognition I received, the more I found myself thinking about my parents. Did they know what I was accomplishing? Had they heard my music on the radio? Did they ever drive past the venues where my name was on the marquee? One night in December, almost exactly 2 years after they'd kicked me out, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I was going to drive by the house again, but this time, if I saw them, I was going to try to talk to them. I had proof now that I wasn't throwing my life away, that I was building something meaningful and valuable. The house looked exactly the same as always, warm light glowing from the windows, my father's car in the driveway. I sat in my car across the street for almost an hour, working up the courage to knock on the door. Finally, just as I was about to get out of the car, the front door opened and my mother appeared. She was taking out the trash, something I'd seen her do thousands of times when I lived there. She moved a little slower than I remembered, and in the porch light, I could see gray in her hair that hadn't been there before. For a moment, she paused and looked in my direction, and I thought she might have recognized my car, but then she went back inside and I lost my nerve. I drove away without knocking, without trying to bridge the gap that had only grown wider with time and success. I told myself I wasn't ready yet, that I needed to accomplish even more before I could face them. But the truth was, I was afraid that even with all my success, they still wouldn't accept me. Afraid that their rejection 2 years ago had been final and absolute. That night, I wrote a new song called Almost Home. It was about being so close to the place you came from, but feeling like you can never really go back. About success that feels incomplete because there's no one to share it with who knew you before you became who you are. It would become one of my most popular songs, but at the time, it just felt like the most honest thing I'd ever written. I was building something beautiful with my music, touching people's lives, making a living, doing what I loved. But I was also building it in the shadow of the family I'd lost, always wondering if the price of following my dreams had been too high. By my 23rd birthday, 5 years after being kicked out, I had achieved something I'd never dared to dream of in those early days, sleeping in hostels and playing for tips. Almost Home had been picked up by a regional radio programmer and was getting airplay across the upper Midwest. Northbound Records had signed me to a larger deal for a full-length album, and Sarah had connected me with a national booking agent who was setting up tours that would take me beyond Minnesota for the first time. The album, which we decided to call Distant Thunder, was recorded over 6 months in a proper studio with session musicians and a bigger budget than I'd ever imagined having access to. Tommy, the producer from my EP, brought in a drummer, a bass player, and even a string section for a few tracks, but we were careful to maintain the intimate, honest sound that had connected with people from the beginning. "We're not trying to make you into something you're not," Tommy explained as we worked on the arrangements. "We're just trying to present what you already are in the best possible light." The recording process was intense and exciting, but also emotionally draining. Many of the songs on Distant Thunder dealt with the ongoing pain of family estrangement, the loneliness of success without people to share it with, and the complex feelings of missing people who had rejected you. Singing these songs over and over again in the studio, getting every emotional nuance just right, meant reliving some of the darkest periods of my life. One song in particular, called Empty Chairs, was about imagining my parents at my concerts, wondering if they would be proud of what I'd accomplished, if they could see past their disappointment about my career choice. Recording that song, I broke down in the middle of a take and had to stop for the day. "This stuff is real for you," Tommy observed as we sat in the control room afterward. "That's what makes it powerful, but it's also what makes it hard. You're not just performing these songs, you're living them every time." When Distant Thunder was released in the spring of my 6th year on my own, the response exceeded everyone's expectations. The album reached number 3 on the regional college radio charts and caught the attention of music journalists beyond the Twin Cities. Rolling Stone gave it a brief but positive review, calling it a stunning meditation on family, belonging, and the price of artistic integrity. But the breakthrough moment came when Almost Home was featured in an independent film that played at the Sundance Film Festival. The film's director had heard the song on college radio and felt it perfectly captured the themes of his movie about a young artist trying to make it in New York City. Suddenly, my music was being heard by industry professionals and music lovers across the country. The phone calls started coming in immediately after Sundance. Record labels from Los Angeles and New York wanted to meet with me. Booking agents were offering tour opportunities I'd never imagined. Music supervisors were asking about licensing my songs for television shows and commercials. Sarah, who had been with me since those early days at the hostel performances, was as excited and overwhelmed as I was. "Marcus, this is it," she said, after we'd taken a particularly important call from A&R representatives at Capitol Records. "This is your shot at the big time, everything we've been working toward for 6 years." The meetings with major labels were surreal. These were companies I'd seen on my favorite albums growing up, organizations that had launched the careers of artists I'd admired my entire life, and they were interested in me, a kid who'd been kicked out of his parents' house for choosing music over medical school. The offers were tempting. Advance money, marketing budgets, national distribution, professional radio promotion. But they also came with strings attached. Some labels wanted me to move to Los Angeles or Nashville. Others wanted to pair me with different producers who might change my sound to make it more commercially viable. "You have to be careful," Tommy warned me over dinner one night. "Major labels can make you famous, but they can also make you into someone you're not. You've built something authentic here. Don't let them take that away from you." After weeks of meetings and negotiations, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I turned down the major label offers and instead signed with a smaller, independent label called Blue Highway Records that specialized in singer-songwriters and promised to let me maintain creative control while providing better distribution and promotion than Northbound could offer. "It's not about the money or the fame," I explained to Sarah, who was worried I was making a mistake. "It's about being able to continue making the kind of music that got me here in the first place. These songs come from real experiences, real emotions. If I compromise that for commercial success, I'll lose the very thing that makes my music worth listening to." The decision proved to be the right one. Blue Highway Records had the industry connections to get Distant Thunder distributed nationally, while still treating me as an artist rather than a product. Within 6 months of the label switch, the album was charting on the Billboard Folk Albums chart, and I was booking shows in major cities across the country. My first national tour was both exhilarating and exhausting. Playing for audiences in Chicago, Denver, Seattle, and San Francisco who had discovered my music through radio or word of mouth was incredibly gratifying. These weren't just people who knew me from the local Minneapolis scene. They were strangers who had connected with my songs from hundreds or thousands of miles away. But touring also meant being away from the support system I'd built in Minneapolis. The loneliness I'd written about in my songs became even more acute when I was sleeping in a different hotel room every night, surrounded by new faces, but missing the familiar comfort of the grind and the community I'd found there. During a show in Portland, Oregon, something happened that would stick with me for years. After I finished Empty Chairs, the song about missing my parents at my concerts, a man in the front row called out, "Your parents are idiots if they can't see how talented you are." The audience applauded, clearly agreeing with the sentiment, but his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd spent years thinking about my estrangement from my parents as a personal failure, as evidence that I hadn't yet accomplished enough to earn their respect. But hearing it framed that way, as their failure rather than mine, was both liberating and painful. After the show, the man approached me at the merchandise table. "I hope I didn't overstep earlier," he said. "I just hate seeing talented people doubt themselves because of other people's limitations." "It's complicated," I replied, not sure how much I wanted to get into it with a stranger. "I'm sure it is," he said, "but I hope you know that what you're doing matters. Your music helped me through a rough patch with my own family. Sometimes the people who are supposed to support us the most are the ones who have the hardest time seeing who we really are." That conversation stayed with me as the tour continued. I started to realize that my music was resonating with people not just because of the specific details of my story, but because of the universal themes: the struggle to be accepted for who you are, the challenge of pursuing your dreams despite opposition, the pain of feeling disconnected from the people who raised you. When I returned to Minneapolis after 3 months on the road, I felt like a different person than the one who had left. I was more confident as a performer, more secure in my identity as an artist, and more aware of the impact my music was having on people's lives. But I was also more conscious of the hole in my life where my family's support should have been. The success of Distant Thunder had brought me everything I'd dreamed of as a struggling musician. Critical acclaim, financial stability, a growing fan base, respect from my peers in the music industry. But it had also made me acutely aware of what was missing. Every review I wanted to show my parents, every milestone I wanted to celebrate with them, every moment of pride that felt incomplete because they weren't there to share it. One evening, as I was preparing for a local show at First Avenue, this time as a headliner, not an opening act, I made a decision that had been building for months. I was going to try one more time to reach out to my parents. Not to apologize for choosing music, not to ask for their approval, but to share what I'd accomplished and see if enough time had passed for us to find some kind of middle ground. I spent hours crafting a letter, trying to strike the right tone. I didn't want to sound bitter or accusatory, but I also didn't want to minimize the pain their rejection had caused. I told them about my career, about the albums and the tours, about the people who had been helped by my music. I included reviews and photos from concerts, evidence that I hadn't thrown my life away, but had built something meaningful and valuable. "I know you wanted me to be a doctor," I wrote near the end of the letter. "I understand that you saw that as the path to security and success, but I hope you can see that I've found my own version of both of those things. I'm not asking you to apologize or to pretend the last 6 years didn't happen. I'm just asking if there might be room in your lives for the son you have, not the son you wished you had." I mailed the letter on a Tuesday afternoon, and then spent the rest of the week in a state of anxious anticipation. Would they respond? Would they throw it away without reading it? Would they be proud of what I'd accomplished, or would they see it as confirmation that I'd chosen the wrong path? Friday came and went with no response. Then Saturday. By the following Tuesday, I was starting to accept that they weren't going to reply. But then, exactly 1 week after I'd mailed the letter, Sarah called me with news that would change everything. "Marcus," she said, and I could hear something unusual in her voice, excitement mixed with concern. "I just got a call from someone claiming to be your mother. She says she got your letter and wants to talk to you." My heart started racing. After 6 years of silence, my mother had reached out. She wanted to talk to me. Maybe, just maybe, the success I'd built had finally been enough to bridge the gap between us. "What did she say?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "She didn't say much," Sarah replied. "Just that she'd read your letter and seen the materials you sent, and that she'd like to meet with you if you're willing. She left a phone number." I stared at the piece of paper where Sarah had written down my mother's phone number. The same number I'd grown up with, the number I'd dialed hundreds of times as a child and teenager, the number I'd been afraid to call for 6 years. Taking a deep breath, I picked up the phone and dialed. After 3 rings, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in 6 years. "Hello?" "Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's Marcus." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. When my mother finally spoke, her voice was softer than I remembered, tentative in a way that caught me off guard. "Marcus," she said, and I could hear the weight of 6 years in those 2 syllables. "Thank you for calling. I wasn't sure if you would." We talked for almost an hour that first conversation, carefully navigating around the hurt and anger that had built up over the years. She told me she'd kept every newspaper clipping about my music career that she could find, that she'd bought my albums and played them when my father wasn't home, that she'd wanted to reach out so many times but hadn't known how. "Your father," she said, and then paused. "He's very proud, you know. It's hard for him to admit when he's wrong. But he's been wrong about this, about you, and I think he's starting to see that." We agreed to meet for coffee the following Saturday at a neutral location, a small cafe in Edina that was halfway between my apartment and their house. I spent the week alternating between excitement and terror. What would I say to her? How much had we both changed in 6 years? Would we be able to bridge the gap that had opened between us, or would this meeting just confirm that too much damage had been done? Saturday morning arrived grey and cold, typical for late October in Minnesota. I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early and sat at a corner table where I could watch the door. When my mother walked in at exactly 2 p.m., my breath caught in my throat. She looked older, smaller than I remembered, but her eyes were the same, kind and intelligent, though now carrying a sadness I didn't remember from before. She spotted me immediately and walked over with careful steps, as if she wasn't sure how close she was allowed to come. We looked at each other for a moment, and then, tentatively, she opened her arms. I stood up and hugged her, and for the first time in 6 years, I felt like I was home. "You look good," she said as we sat down. "Healthy. Happy." "I am happy," I replied, surprised to realize it was true. Most of the time, anyway. We ordered coffee and spent the first few minutes catching up on safe topics. My health, her work at the hospital, the weather. But eventually we had to address the elephant in the room. "I need to apologize," she said, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug as if seeking warmth. "Not just for that night 6 years ago, but for all the nights since then when I should have picked up the phone. I should have been stronger, should have stood up to your father, should have found a way to support both of you." "Mom, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted gently. "What we did to you was wrong. You were 18 years old, our only child, and we threw you out because you wanted to pursue something that made you happy. I've regretted it every single day since." The tears I'd been holding back for 6 years finally came. "I missed you so much," I said. "Every good thing that's happened, every review, every sold-out show, every time someone tells me my music helped them. I wanted to share it with you and Dad. I wanted you to be proud of me." "We are proud of you," she said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "I know your father has a hard time showing it, but he is. When that article in the Star Tribune came out calling you one of Minneapolis's most promising young artists, he cut it out and put it in his wallet. He still carries it. That image, my stoic father carrying a newspaper clipping about my music career in his wallet, nearly broke me. Why didn't he ever tell me that? Because he's stubborn and proud and terrified of admitting he made a mistake," she said. "But also because he's been waiting for you to come home and he didn't know how to make the first move." We talked for 3 hours that afternoon, making up for 6 years of missed conversations. She told me about the family dinners that felt empty without me, about how my father had stopped listening to music entirely because it reminded him of our fight, about how they'd driven past venues where I was performing but never worked up the courage to come inside. I told her about those first desperate months in the hostel, about building a career from nothing, about the loneliness of success without family to share it with. I told her about all the songs I'd written about them, about missing home, about wondering if they ever thought about me. "We thought about you every day," she said. "Your father used to sit in your room sometimes, just looking at your old guitar that you left behind. I think he was starting to understand what music meant to you, but by then, so much time had passed that he didn't know how to fix things." As the afternoon wore on, the conversation turned to the future. My mother wanted to know if there was any possibility of reconciliation with my father, if the wounds could ever fully heal. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I'm willing to try, but he's going to have to meet me halfway. I'm not the same 18-year-old kid he kicked out. I'm a grown man who's built a successful career doing exactly what he told me was impossible. If he can't respect that, then I don't know if this can work." She nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. "He's changed too, you know. This whole thing has been hard on him, harder than he'll ever admit. He misses you more than you know." When we finally said goodbye, it was with plans to meet again the following week, and with her promise to talk to my father about the possibility of a family dinner. Nothing was resolved yet, but for the first time in 6 years, there was hope. The conversation with my father, when it finally happened 2 weeks later, was more difficult than the one with my mother. He was stiffer, less emotional, clearly struggling with how to navigate this reunion. We met at the same cafe, and he spent the first 10 minutes studying my press clippings that my mother had brought along. "This is really what you do now?" he asked, looking at a photo of me performing at First Avenue. "This is your job?" "It's my career, yes," I replied, trying to keep any defensiveness out of my voice. "I make a living writing and performing music. I pay my taxes. I have health insurance. I own my own home. It's not the career you wanted for me, but it's a real career." He was quiet for a long time, processing this information. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes that were sadder than I'd ever seen them. "I was wrong," he said, the words clearly difficult for him to speak. "Not about wanting security for you, that part I stand by, but I was wrong about what security looks like, and I was wrong about what would make you happy. I thought I was protecting you from a life of struggle, but instead I caused you 6 years of pain that you didn't deserve. It wasn't the emotional reunion I'd sometimes fantasized about, but it was honest and real, which was somehow better." We talked for an hour about my career, about his fears when I'd first told them I wanted to pursue music, about the cultural pressures he'd felt as an immigrant parent to ensure his son's success in traditional terms. In Taiwan, when I was growing up, there were only a few paths that led to respect and security, he explained. "I wanted those things for you so badly that I couldn't see that America offers different possibilities, different ways to build a meaningful life." The breakthrough moment came when I played him one of my songs on my phone, "Almost Home," the song that had launched my national career. As he listened to my voice singing about missing family, about feeling close to home but unable to return, I watched his expression change from guarded interest to something that looked like recognition and regret. "You wrote this about us," he said when the song ended. It wasn't a question. "I wrote it about missing you," I replied. "About love that survives rejection, about hoping that someday we might find our way back to each other." He was quiet again, but this time I could see him struggling with emotion. "I never wanted you to feel that way," he said finally. "I thought I was teaching you about responsibility, about making smart choices. I didn't realize I was teaching you that our love was conditional." That was the moment I knew we were going to be okay. Not immediately, not without work, but eventually. Because he finally understood that his love had always been the most important thing to me. More important than career success or financial security or anything else. And I finally understood that his opposition to my music career had come from love too. Misguided and expressed badly, but still love. The family dinner happened a month later, at Thanksgiving. It was awkward at first. 6 years of separation doesn't disappear over turkey and stuffing, but as the evening went on, we found our rhythm again. I told them stories from the road, about the people I'd met and the places I'd played. They told me about their lives over the past 6 years, about the ways they'd changed and grown. But the most important moment came when my father asked if I would play something for them after dinner. I got my guitar from the car and set up in their living room, the same room where we'd had our final argument 6 years earlier. I played Almost Home first because it seemed appropriate. Then I played some of my newer songs, including one I'd written recently called The Long Way Back, about forgiveness and second chances. As I played, I watched my parents' faces, seeing pride and regret and love all mixed together. When I finished, my mother was crying, and even my father's eyes were wet. "I'm sorry we missed so much," he said. "I'm sorry we weren't there to support you while you built all of this." "You're here now," I replied. "That's what matters." Over the following months, we slowly rebuilt our relationship. It wasn't the same as it had been before. Too much had happened for us to simply pick up where we'd left off, but it was better in some ways. We related to each other as adults now, with mutual respect for the choices we'd each made and the people we'd become. My father started coming to my local shows, usually sitting in the back, but always there. My mother became one of my biggest promoters, telling her friends at the hospital about my music and buying copies of my albums to give as gifts. They even traveled to see me perform in Chicago, their first trip out of state in years. The reconciliation with my parents opened up new creative territory for my music. The anger and longing that had fueled my best songs was replaced by more complex emotions. Gratitude, forgiveness, the bittersweet recognition that relationships can survive even terrible mistakes if both parties are willing to do the work. My next album, Second Chances, explored these themes and became my most successful release yet. It reached the top 20 on the Billboard folk charts and earned me my first Grammy nomination. But more importantly, it represented a kind of completion of the journey I'd started that cold December night when I was 18. Looking back now, 30 years after that night when they kicked me out, I can see that the score I thought I needed to settle was never really about proving them wrong or making them regret their decision. It was about proving to myself that I could survive on my own, that I could build something meaningful from nothing, that I could forgive without forgetting and love without losing myself. The young man who stood on that snowy sidewalk with $27 and a broken heart couldn't have imagined the life I've built. Not just the career success, but the deep relationships, the sense of purpose, the knowledge that I've helped other people through their own struggles with family and identity and following their dreams. My parents and I are closer now than we've ever been. They're in their 70s, and I make sure to visit them regularly, to include them in the important moments of my life. We've never pretended that those 6 years of estrangement didn't happen, but we've also never let them define our relationship. Last month, my father surprised me by asking if I would teach him to play guitar. "I want to understand what it feels like," he said, "to make music with your own hands." Breathe as I watch him struggle with chord changes and finger positions, as patient with him as he was never quite able to be with my musical ambitions when I was young. I'm reminded that redemption rarely looks like what we expect it to. I didn't settle the score by becoming famous or rich, or by making them sorry they'd rejected me. I settled it by becoming the kind of person who could forgive them, and by giving them the chance to become the kind of parents who could admit their mistakes and love their son for who he actually is, not who they'd wanted him to be. The boy who was kicked out at 18 dreamed of coming home in triumph, of proving everyone wrong, of settling scores and evening balances. The man I became learned something more valuable, that the best revenge is not revenge at all, but the grace to build something beautiful from the wreckage and the wisdom to know that love, even imperfect love, is always worth fighting for. That's the real score I settled, not with them, but with myself. And that's a victory that will last long after the applause fades and the records stop selling. It's the victory of becoming someone who can stand in any storm and know that he has the strength to weather it and the heart to help others do the same. 30 years later, I'm finally home.